Thanks so much, Tinsley, and hi everybody. Thanks for coming in person or online. So I'm going to talk to you about my vision of the trustworthy company and why this question of whether companies are worthy of our trust needs to replace policy discussions about whether people trust technologies. And in talking about this, I'm going to draw on my work for more than a decade with automated driving as a case study for what I call the law of the newly possible. But a lot of what we talk about with one kind of artificial intelligence application can apply quite readily to others as well. So to start with that, a question for everyone in the room or online, shout it out, type it online, whatever you want. In your view, who drives or operates an automated vehicle? In other words, who is the driver or the operator of an automated car or truck?
Truck drivers.
The software engineers that design the computer that moves the car. Do you mind repeating that?
Somebody here
Great.
says the software engineer that designed the computer of the car.
Thank you. Great microphones in that room. I've heard that. I've heard, I think, the software itself. I think I may have heard the passenger. In the past, I've heard no one at all. No one drives it, right? It's self-driving or it's driverless. In fact, if we look at law, every one of these examples is already reflected in some law, whether it's a state law, whether it's a federal interpretation. So there isn't necessarily one answer, and all of the ones that you've said are in some sense correct. Now, my view of that question is that fundamentally companies drive automated vehicles, that the company behind the technology is the one driving through its machine agents, its hardware and software, and through its human agents. Now, this is reflected in a model law that some states have adopted parts of, but has not been embraced widely, perhaps because companies are not necessarily thrilled with the conclusion that this model law takes. But I use this to frame my discussion because I think it's an essential way of understanding responsibility vis-a-vis new technologies. Responsibility in a legal sense, in a technical sense, really in a moral sense. To give you an example of that, you might be familiar a few years ago with a fatal collision involving a test vehicle being tested by part of Uber at the time and a pedestrian in Arizona. And this was a tragedy that was explained in many different ways, attributed in part to the alleged distraction of the test driver, to the immature state of Uber's technologies, to the extent that it wasn't even looking for the pedestrian because she wasn't in a legal crosswalk. And we can go around and around, right? We can say that, well, Uber's engineers assumed that the driver wouldn't crash, so they could be a little lax in what their system did. And Uber's driver assumed that the AV itself wouldn't crash, so she could be a little lax in what she did allegedly, right? And we can go around in this loop. But fundamentally, my view is that Uber was driving that vehicle through its software, through its engineers, through its driver, and Uber killed that pedestrian. And so that brings me to the key, which is we need to focus less on technologies and more on the companies behind them. What do I mean? Well, very often you'll hear the question, does the public trust this technology? Right? Every week you can find a new survey about whether the public trusts advanced automotive technologies or chatbots or anything. And rather than ask that, I think we need to ask, is the company behind this technology worthy of our trust? All right, so why should we not focus on whether the public trusts the technology? Well, that's an empirical question, right? That's a state of what people actually believe. And we know that the public is fickle, right? We're gonna change our mind 15 times in the next 5 minutes. Our attention span is 5 seconds. Second, words are not actions. Right? If you had asked people 15 years ago, and surveyors did, what do you think of smartphones? The answers would have been creepy, silly, unnecessary. And then suddenly they had a purpose and almost everyone adopted them. Third, a lot of marketing of these new technologies is just starting. That's true of automotive technologies. That's true of chatbots. Right? Some of the most powerful industries have not yet decided that they want us to buy their products and services. And when they do, public opinion is going to reflect that concerted advertising. And finally, a lot changes before 100%. Right? Even if we find out that 80% of the public doesn't want something. That's 20% that does, and that's a pretty significant number. If you think about Uber and Lyft, those companies changed industries, got front page headlines long before their vehicles accounted for even 1% of vehicle miles traveled or registered vehicles. And so instead of asking whether the public trusts this technology, we might ask, well, should the public trust this technology? Now we start getting normative, but still I'm skeptical of this question. For one thing, future technologies don't yet exist. So the answer to should you trust a AI personal assistant or should you trust an automated vehicle should be no, because by and large, with some relatively small exceptions, they don't exist. Second, we're not talking about a single technology, even in one field. We're talking about a wide range of underlying technologies, applications of those technologies, business cases for those applications, participants in those business cases. In other words, there's a great deal of diversity that prevents a one-size-fits-all answer to the question of whether we should trust the technology. And finally, most of these technologies won't be super dangerous, at least as we understand that term in our somewhat short-sighted human way. So what do I mean by that? Well, the baseline expectations for any of these technologies, be it a drone or a car, or potentially a algorithm that gives medical advice or legal advice, is going to be very high. And by virtue of that, the systems we can expect will be within, the same order of magnitude or better than existing activities that are really dangerous. The practice of medicine is really dangerous. Driving is really dangerous. Second, unlike some of the activities, these technologies are likely to be subject to continuous monitoring. That is, they're not going to be put out onto the roads or in our bodies or in our homes and never be monitored or updated. They'll be undergoing constant monitoring. In other words, safety will be treated not like a wedding, a one-time event, but as a marriage, a lifelong commitment where there will be continued upgrades and updates. And this is what I mean by dynamic adjustments. That is, if something seems to be extra dangerous, it's not going to be kept on the road or in the sky or in our bodies. If there is room for improvement, that improvement is going to be made insofar as it can be software-based. And so all of this suggests that these vast unbounded questions of risk will in some ways be more straightforward. At the same time, we know that our risk models are pretty bad at accounting for mass failures, for unintended systemic consequences, for unforeseen long-term impacts, right? The possibility that a technology will just make us all more dependent or less intelligent or less creative, and that in the moment of greatest need, say evacuating a city before a hurricane, we'll suddenly realize that our devices don't work and we can't drive and we can't even move, right? And so there are things that I want to recognize on a larger scale may not be accounted for by this conception of safety. But the reality is that this is the story of technology or progress or policy or law, right? We take one set of problems, we replace them with a new set of problems, and we just really hope that in aggregate, our new set is smaller than our old set. My favorite example of this is over 120 years ago, where the internal combustion engine came around and people said, whoa, this is the environmentally friendly transport technology. We have greened our transport. We have solved our pollution problems forever. What were they talking about? Shout it out in the room if you can guess.
Horse manure.
Why was the car the environmentally friendly solution?
Horse manure.
Thank you. Thank you for shouting horse manure in a crowded room. I appreciate that. Yes. Right. The average horse produces about 25 pounds of manure a day. In New York City around 1900, there were 100,000 horses. You all can do the math. This was a serious problem. And so the car came around, it solved that problem until it turned out that it didn't. And that's going to be, for better or worse, the story of so much of our technologies. All right, so we shouldn't focus on whether the public should trust a technology. For many of these reasons, what should we focus on? In my view, whether the company behind the technology is worthy of our trust. Why? So first, companies act through their human agents, i.e. their employees and managers, and through their machine agents, their hardware, their software, their tools. Fundamentally, it is companies acting when their machines act on the world. And those machines are fundamentally only as safe as the companies behind them. A irresponsible, reckless company is likely to produce a irresponsible, reckless machine. And this is why I emphasize that safety needs to be a marriage, not a wedding. That is, if we focus on only the product, there's likely to be one gateway for safety, right? It passes a test, there's an event, and then we put it out into the world. Whereas if we treat safety as a lifelong commitment, then it encompasses the decisions that an early startup makes about who to hire, what standards to follow. It encompasses the period when a product has been deployed. Is it being appropriately monitored? Is it being updated? Is there enough support? All the way through disposal of the product or termination of the service. And similarly, throughout that lifetime, the products themselves are going to fail, right? Cars are going to crash. Software is going to be buggy. At that point, the technology has failed, but the company can still do right. And I'll talk about what that means, but the company has an opportunity still to not fail even when its technologies do. Right? So why should we look at safety regulation through this lens of trustworthiness? In other words, as we think about ways of regulating these products? Well, for a few reasons. First, a lot of these emerging technologies are complex. They're stochastic-y, by which I mean they're either non-deterministic or functionally they're non-deterministic because they're so complex that we can't tell the difference. And they're dynamic. They're always changing. The developers of these systems are going to have a vast amount of expertise, information, access to the products to make arguments for their life cycle safety. Information that often regulators and certainly the public are often going to lack. Third, developers are going to need some space for technical innovation. Right? Just as we wouldn't say to the developer of an automated vehicle, you need to have exactly 5 LiDAR units, right? 5 laser units placed on these exact places on a car, and they need to be exactly this wavelength. We would say to them, figure out what you need to do it safely. We wouldn't necessarily want to say to the developer, this is exactly what safety means. Make your safety case exactly this way, because it could end up stagnating safety. And similarly, regulators are going to have to learn a lot fast, and that includes how to pace their regulation with the dramatically changing speed of technology. And so that means they're going to need some space to innovate as well. And finally, regulators are not going to have all the answers, but they can get better at asking questions. And I think a focus on trustworthiness allows them to step back and look at the more meta level of safety. And I should say that when I say safety, I mean this in a very broad sense, right? Physical, emotional, and financial security in the present and in the future. There are dramatically different approaches to conceiving safety and conceiving design for safety, right? There are philosophical arguments like those about centralized or decentralized systems, or open versus closed systems, or complex versus simple systems that are never going to be resolved fully empirically. And so that's why we need to be able to have some flexibility to make the cases for a variety of approaches. So given that, how safe is safe enough? This is a common question we'll see with respect to many different technologies. I break it up into 2 perspectives. The first is the retrospective, looking backwards after a failure has already happened. And the second is prospective, right? Before we're deployed, before there's been a failure, when we're trying to figure out whether something should be released upon the world. So the retrospective question, and I think is actually fairly easy. Retrospective safety probably means at least as safe as a human in the equivalent subtask, and at least as safe as a comparable or competing system. And this is the one that's a little bit more controversial under existing law, right? Safer than the last system to fail. This really borrows from the aviation model that you don't get to make the same mistake twice. Now, prospective safety gets a little trickier because it's lagging rather than leading. We don't have all the data to analyze. And that's why my answer is prospective safety means reasonable confidence that the developer is worthy of our trust. All right, I've teased that now for 10 minutes. What do I mean by a trustworthy company? In my view, a trustworthy company does 3 things. It shares its safety philosophy, it makes a promise to the public, and it keeps that promise. So what do I mean by sharing its safety philosophy? Basically telling a story, right? Here's what we know. Here's what we don't. Here's what's working. Here's what's not. Here's what's promising. Here's what's hard. This is what we're doing. This is why we think it's reasonably safe. And this is why you can believe us. By making a promise to the public, a company says we market only what we believe to be safe. We will be candid about our limits and failures. And when we fail, we will make it right. And the company then keeps that promise by appropriately managing public expectations, right? Not hyping, by supervising the entire product lifecycle, even after a system has been deployed, and by mitigating harms promptly, fully, and this is important, publicly. And so one way of thinking about this is thinking about what it's not, and using a canary in the coal mine model, looking for early breaches of trust. What do I mean by that? Well, a company that makes hyperbolic claims, right? That asserts that something is true when it's not, that exaggerates the ability of its systems, that claims something is ready for the market when in fact it's years behind, is breaching the public trust. A company that misrepresents evidence, that fails to update its technologies, that exploits the litigation process to use its power to prevent people from recovering rather than the substantiveness of the underlying legal and factual arguments. And a company that forces confidential settlements, that is prevents safety relevant information from reaching the public, is breaching the public trust. The best example I can come up with right now is, if we can't trust you when you call your system full self-driving, and I'm looking at one company in particular here, then why should we trust you when you call your system safe, right? If you hype in one area, then why should we believe you in another area? In the same way, I could call my umbrella a parachute. That will not make it true. It'll just make my umbrella a whole lot more dangerous. So what does law do about this? What can public policy do about this? Well, in my view, it justifies a shift toward expanded duties in the law. And we can ground these duties in administrative law, or in the rules that administrative agencies impose on companies. We can ground these, as I often do, in tort law, which are the rules that a court or a jury will apply to companies, basically the public expectations that we will have for companies and the liability they will face if they fail to live up to them. What are these duties? I'm happy to go more into depth in questions. Say first, a duty to refrain from puffing, right? To not exaggerate, a duty to update products as new dangers come about, a duty to promptly and fully compensate, not just to compensate when ordered to do so by a court at the end of a 10-year appeal, but to promptly and fully compensate when the facts point to that being justified. A duty to refrain from concealment that includes requirements of confidentiality that could prevent the public from having information not just about the safety performance of the system, but about a company's willingness to, say, promptly and fully compensate. And finally, a duty of due process, that is, duty to apply principles of due process, which traditionally apply only as against governments in a private company's dealings with ordinary consumers, right? So a consumer can find out what the basis of a decision was, has a process of appeal, has an opportunity to be heard, has reasoned decision-making, has, in the words of the Biden administration, an opportunity to have a human review a judgment. And this is an interesting duty that actually seems to pull from both conservative and liberal policy inclinations. So that perhaps means that there's a chance for it to actually happen. Again, a lot of these are not existing duties in a strict sense, but we can find enough analogies and precedents that their extension to the modern powerful company would be a relatively easy and I think reasonable legal argument to make. Because in my view, fundamentally, this comes back to the increasing power of companies over us and our lives, the proximity that they enjoy to their products, their services, their users, and those uses. And so I will end by quoting, depending on your preference, either Voltaire or Spider-Man's uncle, and that is, with great power comes great responsibility. What we're talking about is companies acting through their machine agents in exercising tremendous power, and law and public policy should demand responsibility commensurate with that. I'm looking forward to the other talks and to our discussion. Thank you so much.
All right. All right, well, welcome. My name is Jennifer. This is Phil. We are actually students, doctoral students at Marymount, and we will be talking today about cybersecurity and other risks of artificial intelligence in healthcare-enabled systems. Okay. So for the agenda today, we're just gonna do a quick introduction. We're gonna talk about some of background information of AI, informed consent, black box algorithms, and some case studies which will represent some of the issues that we can see with AI and the healthcare industry.
With we're in terms of we'll be going over some things about policy, law, and trustworthiness of AI in healthcare. With AI, we need to first talk about the definition. There is no universally accepted definition for what AI is, but ML, which is machine learning, is a subset of AI. And there are three types of machine learning, which are important to understand. There is supervised machine learning, which is where someone is training the computer on and labeling the data set, which is going into AI. There's unsupervised, which there is no labeling, and it uses clustering of the data. And then there's deep learning, which uses a lot of computational powers and is using patterns from various different layers. And it's similar to a neural network and is meant to mimic the human brain. When we're talking about AI in healthcare, some important areas we need to talk about is biases in AI, transparency, and the system design of AI in healthcare. AI has been talked about a lot in the news. Many of you have probably heard of ChatGPT, which is frequently talked about. And even this morning, Microsoft was, they talked about it on GMA this morning about AI. And with this rise in AI, there's a rise in publications in AI in healthcare, and you can see there's been an exponential growth. There's not a lot of guidance with publications in terms of how AI should be done in healthcare. There's a group here actually in DC called HSCC, which is the Healthcare Sector Coordinating Council. They recently, February 6th, I believe, published some guidance on how AI should be used in healthcare. And they published 9 guidelines. Some guidelines which they didn't talk about, which needs to be looked into is ethical concern, informed consent, privacy, and legal concerns. With the reason that we need to talk about legal concerns of informed consent in AI is because sometimes we don't really know what's going on with it. AI can frequently be a black box. And in terms of getting informed consent, we really need to, in the healthcare field at least, you need to have an information session with the patient. They need to be able to express that they understand what's going on, which can be hard to do because you sometimes don't even know what's going on with it. And they need to voluntarily give that consent. Sorry. Here you can see what the black box is. We have some sort of data going in. There's some processing that goes on in the background, and you get some output. And depending on how good that data is, if you have garbage data in, you frequently will get garbage data out unless your algorithm has some magic to fix that garbage. So as I said, with the black box, we don't really know what's going on. So some other laws that we need to consider when talking about patient consent and data privacy with AI programs is we need to talk about HIPAA, GDPR, and other state laws such as California's as well as Virginia's.
As we mentioned before, there is a disconnect when it comes to the use of AI in health systems and the patient consent. Sometimes it is difficult in order to translate what the AI is doing within the Black's algorithms because the algorithm itself is unknown or misunderstood. The data that is going in, we know. The data that is coming out, we kind of know, but what is being translated within the AI in a black box is kind of unknown. Here, I am going to discuss two cases of two systems, AI or natural language systems that were meant originally to facilitate what was health care diagnosis or some sort, but ended up in complete failures. For the first one, we have the IBM Watson. So the IBM Watson was a kinetic system developed to assist in cancer treatment decision-making. Basically, what this was meant to do was the doctors would input data, was medical data and other sorts of data. So imagine, God forbid, that I had cancer. So all of the cancer data that was collected, whether it was analysis, scans, and all sorts of data, it was input into this IBM Watson system. The system would ask my doctor other further questions to conduct this analysis. The Watson system then would also continue to collect data from other sources that it had access to. And ideally, it would compute different treatment plans. It would actually diagnose me and compute treatment plans that would then be used to present to the patient and say, this is what you have and these are your choices. However, even though The purpose of this was to basically help with cancer diagnosis and treatment options. There were quite a few shortcomings that it was presented. The first one, and the one that is going to be an ongoing issue, it was the cost. IBM Watson was so expensive that only the top of the top tier of organizations and hospitals or centers were able to afford this. No small hospital or centers would ever be able to even know about this, like touch their hands on this. Another issue was lack of customization. So this was a generalized thing. It was not able to be customized to the needs of the patient or specific situations. So whether my cancer was a brain cancer, gut cancer, whether I was female, male, big, small, it does not matter. You have to just get scanned and trust in the algorithm gods that the results were going to be what they needed to be. Another issue that was presented with this, or another shortcoming, was the fact that it was very complex to use. It was complex to understand. So the results of this, the IBM Watson, was difficult to interpret. This slowed everything down. Not only was it difficult for anybody to understand what was coming out of this machine, or well, this system, I'm sorry, but it also slowed it down, because when things are moving and everybody's trying to interpret and move forward, if you've ever been to a hospital or a hospital system, everybody's like running. You needed to slow down and find the one person who could interpret these results in order to be able to move forward. Now, there were also a few ethical concerns when it came to the IBM Watsons. Well, there were multiple, but I'm just going to touch upon two of them, which was the data use was from specific narrow sources. You know, in the previous picture where I show you that there were data feeding into the system, besides the one that the doctor was given it from the patient, the data where it was being referencing to be able to make the diagnosis, that was limited. So that created some biases. Imagine you creating a rainbow and the only color wheel that you were able to use was a monochromatic. So your rainbow was not going to have all the colors that it needed. That's what was happening here with the IBM Watson. Another ethical concern was that the system was originally trained with synthetic data. So the training of the system was now with actual patients or actual human data. So yeah, let me create food, plastic food, to tell you how real food tastes. That's kind of what was happening here. So what was the actual outcome of this? Inaccurate or incomplete results. This was a complete failure. It ended up being taken down for parts. As you can imagine, by using this for a little bit, a whole lot of data was collected, medical data. And as we know, I'm not going to touch upon this, but data, it's important. So the data was used for other projects, but this is no longer a viable solution. Another example of medical device that had the potential to be AI medical device or system that had the potential to be great or help, but ended up in failure, is the EPIC sepsis model. This was supposed to, this was a predictive model, first of all. It was supposed to identify patients that were at risk from developing sepsis. If you don't know what sepsis is basically a severe life-threatening disease or condition. It's more like a condition that comes if you have an infection. When the infection goes very bad, you become septic. So this system actually utilized data that was in electronic health data. So when you go to a doctor and they collect all your vitals and all of this was what this system actually used in order to create a sepsis risk score. So, you know, your vitals and all of these things, plus clinical data. This was great. Like theoretically, this was great because it allowed doctors to have that early decision. It allowed them to improve the outcomes, because if you know earlier, you can treat the issue earlier and less people die from this. It also improved efficiency because it allowed the medical staff to prioritize the higher risk. When you have the right higher risk score, this person needs my attention now. So it kind of made things move along theoretically. Awesome, the theory, right? So what happened here? Awesome. It relied only on the records that were the electronic health records of the place where this system was located. It completely disregarded, ignored any records that were external to it. So if I went to this clinic that had this system, everything else from outside, all of my doctor's external things were ignored. Doesn't matter what it was. This is just a localized data system. Very much like the IBM Watson, it was extremely expensive. So the same issues that came with the cost, it was presented here. And ironically, but not really, it was also very difficult to use and customization was not there. This was kind of like, I want to push this out and I want it to work, but I am not really taking into consideration that we still have different body type and different things that we need to customize. Let's talk about the results. Let's just jump right into the results. 67% of sepsis cases were missed using this system. To put it into perspective, 6 out of 10 people with sepsis were missed. So if we were only using this to determine if somebody was septic, 6 people out of 10 would have died. There was an 18% false positive rate. So like I said before, people in hospitals are running around like hellish chickens trying to get things done. Imagine you getting 18% alerts. This person is septic, this person is septic. That is just added work for no reason. If I was a hospital person, I would be so annoyed that I would probably throw that out the window. And it's expensive, so it would have been my job. And by the way, there was only a 7% rate of identification of sepsis that was missed by doctors, which means this could have been a multiple choice and I put an A in every answer and I probably got a better score than they did. That is the honest truth. So having said this, imagine how many people would have died of sepsis if this was the only system being used to identify septic patients. There is another ethical question that I would like to pose when we are analyzing briefly the IBM Watson and the Epic Sepsis model is, when introducing an AI system in a healthcare environment, what will happen to the relationship, the patient healthcare provider relationship, that one-on-one, let's talk, how do you feel? These systems do not really pick up on feelings, physical characteristic. I could say I'm fine, but if you see me turning pink because I have a high fever, that tells you other things. So that is one of the things that I want you to consider when you continue to listen to our presentation.
Thank you. We'll be talking about ethical implications of AI. In terms of ethics, we need to talk about possible data overcharging for procedures, which AI systems might have the potential to do, as well as training data biases, which is also important. Data also may not be labeled correctly. With early artificial intelligence biases, many of you may have heard originally with Apple and Face ID, it had its initial flaws. It didn't always get people's face correct. And that's because it was frequently trained on Caucasian people, and other races it wasn't trained on because that's not the people that worked at the tech companies. Google had its own problems with facial recognition, and it misclassified African American people. There's also been cases in a hospital where they treated people that had asthma, they ranked them as high risk. So the training data, because they were ranked at high risk, they went to the ICU first. So people in these settings, the training data was off because they had better outcomes even though they were at a higher risk.
Hey, Philip,
Yeah.
I need you to wrap it up so that way we can make sure that Charles has enough time to present and we leave enough time for questions at the end.
Okay.
But this is all very interesting. I'm sorry to interrupt it.
Okay. So let me give you some conclusions. Let me wrap it up. As you can see from this slide, not a lot of people, there's not a majority of people that trust AI. It's currently about a third of a split in terms of people trusting, people unsure, and people not trusting AI systems. Our data was limited to the healthcare field. So that's one of our limitations. Future research which needs to be done is explainable AI.
Bing has AI now in search bar. You see that? The Bing data testers or beta testers right now. So I have Bing in my, I have AI in my Bing search bar now. It's really cool actually.
It's crashing.
It's crashing.
Oh,
Stop the screen.
Can anyone see my PowerPoint?
We need you to stop sharing the screen in DC.
Oh,
okay. I'm about to restart the Zoom really quick. We have froze. Actually, it might be a software.
Stealing your secrets.
There it is.
are we ready to go? Can you all hear me?
I think they're restarting the Zoom. So we'll
Oh.
give it, yeah.
Okay.
Could be a. Oh, never mind. We're good. Hello, can you see us?
Yes, we can.
We do.
Shall I start now?
Yes, the screen share. Do you mind resharing your screen, please? Oh, sorry, I just looked away. There you go. We're good.
Now?
Oh, we're good now.
Good? Oh, good, good. That's good. Okay, let me from the beginning. Great. So you all can see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this particular session talking about the emerging technology. I thank for all the participants for this event. And it's my pleasure to share my personal opinions on some very important aspect of the cybersecurity, which is the IPv6 and the impact on all the emerging technologies, including the my peer speakers talking about AI, talk about the smart cards. So I have to make sure that I have this disclaimer here and shortly. So there are a lot of topics to talk about, but I'm not going to talk all of them in details given the time constraint. I will cover the main points I'm trying to make and welcome for any follow-up questions.
Excuse me.
this is the
If you
disclaimer.
if you don't mind resharing your screen again or switching your share
Oh.
screen. Yeah, sorry.
Oh,
Yeah, we're stuck
okay.
on.
Hold on, let me stop this one. Save share.
Yeah, the slides were just not advancing.
Okay, let me see what happened.
I don't think you started the slideshow for the PowerPoint yet, so that's why it's not advancing, maybe.
It's the screen share is stuck on screen 1, so you have to stop screen sharing, and then he did click.
Maybe I need to screen share one.
Stop share. I'll stop share.
Hopefully I don't have to reboot the whole thing. Can you see my screen now? Oops. No.
Okay. I was resetting to get you to share just the PowerPoint.
Are we okay now? Or?
If you mind hitting the screen share button on the bottom and selecting one with just the PowerPoint.
Extra. Do you see anything now?
There's a slight delay.
Oh,
Must be the internet bandwidth right now.
Huh.
In my little small hometown, we had to build a fiber optic network. We do not see the PowerPoint yet. It's I think last time I looked away for a second.
do you see anything now?
Yeah. So if you don't mind staying in this window and just
This window?
arrow down. Yeah, arrow down. Yeah. You won't be able to, we won't see that. Try it. Oh, no. Yeah, so it's stuck on screen 2 with but we'll go with this. This works.
It's
Yes.
moving?
Yes.
You see now?
Yes. Yeah. Are we good?
Are we
Are we
okay?
Do
Good.
you like this? Okay. Yeah, so we like this. We'll go.
Oh, you can see it? Okay, great. I'm sorry for the technical glitches. So I have to have this disclaimer. The views presented here are only personal opinions, so they do not necessarily represent those of the U.S. government. So you can see I did wrote quite a few articles publicly on this particular subject. And then, namely, I started in 2014 when I worked with the Federal IPv6 Task Force. And there's a reason I go to public and write that the personal opinion articles. Obviously, not everybody agreed to what I was talking about at the time. And so I stopped writing publicly since 2020. And I may still need to resume to write at least one more if needed on the very same subject. So the 2020, in November 19th, the US government, OMB, issued a memo and addressing basically a lot of the issues that have been talked about since 2014. So I think, personally, I think my mission has accomplished, but it will still have a long way to go. Let's move on to the rest of it. Oh, no. Those are hyperlinks. My apologies.
We still see PowerPoint.
Do you see a new screen moving?
Yes, we see PowerPoint.
Okay, great. So I'm not going to go too details about the concept and all the IPv6. I only want to highlight that IPv4 have a total of 4.3 billion possible IP addresses. All of them have been used or have been allocated. You can no longer get any new IPv4 addresses whatsoever. That has been stopped a few years ago. IPv6, on the other hand, have more than what we need for now. So it's a 4.3 billion versus the 340 trillion IP addresses. Visually, that's a huge difference. Obviously, IPv6, the syntax are different, the format of the addresses. I'll talk briefly about why IPv6 matters. And in my 2014 articles, I mentioned it's a matter of leadership, vision, and a competitive edge. I think that's a 2016 article. And for the very same reason at the time, we no longer have any more IPv4 addresses. Cloud computing needed more. IoT, the Internet of Things, definitely need more. And on top of that, we go back to one of the founders or inventors of we call the fathers of the Internet, Dr. Vint Cerf, many of you may know. He, in one of the speeches, I think a few years ago at the George Washington University, I did attend in person. He said that IPv6 deployment still considered from his perspective as one of the fathers of the Internet who co-invented the TCP/IP protocol. He thinks this is the unfinished business of the Internet. So it is important from the perspective of the fathers, one of the fathers of the Internet. On top of that, this is the Washington D.C. So a lot of government agencies and a lot of private sectors doing business, and the nationwide, maybe worldwide, with the U.S. government. This is one of the requirements since December 2009. It's required, it's far required to be IPv6 capable. Since then, there are a lot of OMB memos. The last one is the latest one, is the 2020 memo I mentioned earlier. I will come back to that shortly. So DoD need that. The needs to have information. This is the 2020 memo. And there's a lot of hyperlinks. In this particular memo, there's specific deadlines and the milestones. Basically by 2025, but just 2 more years down the road, or 3 years. And we should, on the government side at least, minimum 80% of all IP-enabled network infrastructures, computer systems running IPv6 only. This is critical. And a very aggressive agenda, very aggressive schedule and mission. But there's a reason for that. Why? Let's take a look. Because when we do IPv4 and IPv6, basically we double the overall so-called overall attack vectors or attack surface. IPv4, v6 don't talk to each other. When you enable it on your computer, you look at it right now. If you're running Windows, v6 is enabled by default. You have both v4 and v6 running. Apples and the Linux machines all the same. Now all the hardware that you buy, by default, they enable IPv6. So you have both IPv4 and the v6 enabled. And if your software, like firewalls and antivirus is not up to date in terms of protecting both V4 and the V6 stack, guess what? The bad actors can attack your computers right now without even you notice, because you do not have the tools to detect V6 traffic. So the moment you turn it off, we'll achieve immediate reduction. That's a material fact. This is a common sense I've been arguing since 2014 publicly in my writings and speeches, but not many people agree to that very basic common sense and the material fact. But I will continue my message and conversations with whoever wants to listen, and hopefully we can come to consensus. So I'm not going to talk too much about the global status. So right now at the Valentine's Day, we have a 44% based on the ISOC, the Internet Society. They track the top 1,000 websites.
Hey, Charles,
So-
we only have a
Yeah.
few minutes left and I want to leave some room for questions. So can you wrap up real quick?
Sure, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, definitely. So this is no problem. So this will have here 44%. The trend is going very quickly. So this is right now Google saying about 40, 43, 44. Interesting that the Chinese government also have a goal here. So you see the OMB have by 2023 have 80%, and this is according to the public information from China. They're going to have 95%. Or the public will be sooner. This is the current status with the government. There's the public sectors. You see the red, and those are not being in compliant or have not been doing anything on V6. And this is similar. This is the private sectors. Even you can see more. This is the universities. They track this all by the NIST IPv6 monitor. So the green means that they are V6 enabled. Those are the different services, the email, DNS, and the web service. So the private sectors, the universities are not there. Why is it important? The data breach. So this is kind of consistent. Verizon have this annual data breach investigation report, just as of last year's, for the information provided or gathered for 2021. We still have over 5,000 confirmed data breaches. That's more than 14 per day. This is consistent with the year before. And compared with 25 years ago, the increase doubled, more than doubled. Ransomware, so increased 15%, 13%, total 25. So this is a pick. I will skip most of them here. So this is we are slowly adopting the best practice in terms of enable best security standard. So this is a lot of examples here. This is public data. We do not have the secured website using the HTTPS. And also when we look at the TLS, so the different versions, those are the old issues. There are a lot of information here. I will skip most of them. So the NIST guidelines saying only by January 21st, January 1st, 2024, we'll have the TLS 1.3 adopted. Just guess what? Between now and then, and the TLS 1.1, 1.2 has been breached, so they are not secure. This is just some of the examples. They come back to the same thing, 100% reduction, and then 50% reduction overall if we turn off IPv4 while we're deploying V6. That's my main point here. And I will jump to this picture here. This is the V6. You look at the blockchain, IoTs, smart cars, smart cities, they all relying on anything relying on the internet, and the future of the internet have to rely on the V6 to be securely deployed so that we can have those innovations and emerging technologies to become reality. So I will jump very quickly here. This is the trend, the
We need
projections.
to wrap up so we can have 5 minutes for questions.
Yeah, well, I have 3 pointing here, so I will finish within another 30 minutes. I mean, 30 seconds. By 2023, 27, depends on who you talk to, 25. So in summary, IPv6 is the future of the internet. The single stack of IPv6 is the best possible cybersecurity posture in the future for a lot of reasons. And some of them are highlighted. So actually, I think I made it right within 20 minutes. Let's see, I will stop sharing.
Thank you.
Sure.
So we do have a question from the app, and this is for Bryant. It says whether and how regulators can provide incentives for commercial vehicle manufacturers to be more transparent in communicating what works and what does not with regard to automated driving systems.
What was the question again?
So this is for Bryant. Whether and how regulators can provide incentives for commercial vehicle manufacturers to be more transparent in communicating what works and what does not with regard to automated driving systems.
Oh, thank you. So it was ways that regulators could push for greater transparency, if I understood that correctly. Yeah, so something that the US government started doing, but then did I think very poorly, was something called voluntary safety self-assessments. And this was really a public safety case, expecting a company to explain what they're doing, why they think it's reasonably safe, and why the rest of us should believe us. The problem, as I think your question points to, is that they were voluntary, and they quickly turned into just marketing exercises with neither a carrot nor a stick. So what could a regulator do? It could require public safety cases. That is, expect a company to explain the safety of their system in exchange for a benefit. In the case of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration or the Federal Aviation Administration, often what that is the ability to get an exemption from a requirement that otherwise apply. So under NHTSA's regime, for example, a company that wants to deploy a vehicle that does not comply with the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards as written needs to show that their system would be at least as safe as one that complied with those standards. And that allows NHTSA to require a company to explain to some extent publicly why they think their system is safe. So that's an example of using a regulatory carrot. You want something you otherwise could not get to encourage this transparency. Likewise, on the enforcement angle, a regulator could take into account a company's good behavior, that is their honesty, their candor, their circumspection in evaluating the conditions for an investigation and in imposing a consent agreement, basically using this mechanism of reputation to regulate, where good actors that have a good record are given a little bit more leeway, and potentially bad faith actors incur a great deal more scrutiny. So I've spoken generally. I think your specific question was about commercial trucking, if I understand. And there, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, which just released a new rule, I think could adopt aspects of this reputational approach in its regulation. And likewise, states that also play a role in cooperatively regulating trucking could expect this kind of public representation and public commitment from these companies, basically to expect one company within this ecosystem to raise their hand and say, Yeah, we vouch for the safety. In a sense, we are acting as the driver. Did that help? That was at least a start to your very good question.
It was from the app, so you would also be able to directly talk with that person. But I want to thank everybody for coming. It is time to get ready for the next presentation in this room. So you guys can email the panelists if you have other questions. But yeah, thank you so much, guys. Have a good evening.